Hi guys, my name is Bryce Fender, and today I'm going to be reading you guys a chapter from the book It Happened in Ohio by Carol Cartano. The name of the chapter we're going to be reading today is called On Thin Ice. It takes place in the year of 1838, and it's about a slave that escapes to the north through the Underground Railroad. So I have a slideshow to go along with my read aloud. So there's the information about the book that I just told you is on pages 77 through 81 in the book. So there's many different purposes for reading this story. So number one, the story provides an accurate representation of the risks that slaves would take to escape from slavery in the South. It is a true story. Number two, stories such as these were instrumental in revealing the horrors of slavery to the Northerners, which in turn got them more on board with the war effort. And number three, it shows us Ohio's role in the Underground Railroad by mentioning key Ohioan abolitionists who fought to bring the slaves to freedom. So On Thin Ice, 1838. It was late February 1838, and one of the 2.5 million blacks enslaved in the land of the free, these United States had made a decision. She was going to try to escape north, perhaps with the help of that shadowy network whispered about on the slave grapevine that would come to be known as the Underground Railroad. The farm she lived on was in Dover, Kentucky, from which you could almost toss a flat rock and see it skip across the surface of the broad Ohio River. That storied river, the dividing line between North and South, had more than 400 miles of frontage in Ohio to tempt adventurous or desperate blacks to try to make it across to the other side. We can't add and thus to freedom because the Fugitive Slave Act and later amendments to it, passed to placate slave-owning states, meant that a runaway slave arriving in Ohio or any other northern state would have to make it from there all the way to Canada before he or she would truly be free. But of the states bordering the South, Ohio was the shortest, only 210 miles deep, so the trip through it to Lake Erie and then over to Canada was not impossible. The heroine of our story was going to see if she could do it. The decision had really been made for her. Her owners, the Davis family, had not subjected her to any of the extraordinary cruelties that other slave orders had been known to inflict on their charges, but they had fallen into financial difficulties. As a result, her bright and lively 2-year-old son, she had lost 2 children earlier, would be separated from her tomorrow and sold to the highest bidder. So late that night, she grabbed him and headed for the river. The nearest town on the Ohio side was Ripley, a bustling, irreverent little city that made much of its living off the traffic on the Ohio. Steamboats and flatboats hustled to and fro with cargoes and deliveries, including many a bale of tobacco and barrel of pork, for Ripley had tobacco warehouses and was the second biggest pork processing center after Cincinnati. But 2 additional things made Ripley a name that resounds in the history of the Underground Railroad. The river was relatively narrow and shallow here, and the town's inhabitants included a fair number of people willing to risk censure, violence, and imprisonment to lend a hand to slaves fleeing northward. Our heroine may not have known all of this, but she'd heard that the Ohio River had been frozen over the past week. When she finally reached the shore, however, it was clear that the ice was melting. A kindly white man on the Kentucky side gave her food and a chance to rest while she figured out what to do. He warned her that the river was no longer a slick, sturdy highway to deliverance, but a death trap. He was still trying to talk her out of attempting to cross when the sound of the slave catcher's dog pack reached their ears. She bolted for the door as he quickly wrapped her child in a woolen shawl and pulled a long wooden rail off his fence to aid her in the journey. Just before the dogs reached her, she jumped onto the ice and headed for Ohio. The ice cracked and groaned and broke beneath her feet as she scrambled to secure a place for herself and her son on the bigger floating pieces. Leaping from floe to floe as best as she could, she was soon soaked with freezing water. The fence rail saved her from sinking several times as she shunted the small body of her son ahead of her on the ice slabs. When she finally reached the other side, both she and her shivering child cried out in fear and in exhaustion. Ironically, the precarious ice is what saved them. The river crossings, especially when ice over, were zealously watched by slave catchers and bounty hunters. This night was no exception. A sometime slave catcher by the name of Chauncey Shaw had heard the commotion of her crossing, but he was so moved by her courage that he said, Any woman who crossed that river carrying her baby has won her freedom. He helped our heroine to her feet, scurried through Ripley with her, and pointed her toward a red brick house on a hill near the edge of town. Once she climbed the steep wooden steps up that hill, she was at the home of John Rankin, a Presbyterian minister and ardent abolitionist. Rankin's letters on slavery, written to a brother who had bought some slaves, were printed in the local paper and eventually made into a book that became required reading for the anti-slavery movement across the country. During their 40 years in Ripley, Rankin and his large family helped more than 2,000 escapees from slavery. Soon our heroine and her child were warm and dry and on their way to several of the numerous other stations by which slaves were spirited away and sheltered on the often circuitous route to Canada. In this case, one of the stations was the home of Levi Coffin, another very influential figure, often called the president of the Underground Railroad. Levi's wife gave our heroine the name Eliza Harris, and if that name and her story sounds somewhat familiar, it is because this is the real-life tale upon which the most dramatic episode in Uncle Tom's Cabin was based. The book President Lincoln said not entirely, facetiously, had started the Civil War. The Eliza crossing the ice chapter of Uncle Tom's Cabin had even been called the most memorable passage in all of the 19th century literature. The real-life Eliza was short, plump, and dark, while Harriet Beecher Stowe's Eliza was light, lissom, and lovely. But then as now, show business is show business, and all is fair in love and the quest to win readers. The real-life Eliza eventually reached Canada and settled in Chatham, Ontario. Amazingly enough, 3 years later, she reappeared at Rankin's home while he was hoeing his garden and announced that she had returned to rescue the rest of her children. Some accounts say her daughter and grandchildren. With the help of a crafty Americanized Canadian, she succeeded in doing so, although the undertaking was made more difficult by the daughter's insistence on carrying out not just the children, but also several hundred pounds of personal possessions that she was loath to leave behind. Today, the Rankin House, complete with a reconstruction of those wooden stairs, is a National Historic Landmark. The National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, which the Chicago Tribune called the one museum you need to see in Cincinnati if you see only one, is full of information and other dramatic stories about the Underground Railroad. One of those stories is that of Margaret Garner. Margaret, a slave mother who escaped to Cincinnati and was recaptured there by slave hunters, killed her daughter and tried to kill her other children rather than see them return to servitude. The state of Ohio tried to charge her with murder in hopes of keeping her and then quietly releasing her, but the slaveholders invoked the Fugitive Slave Act. Margaret was returned to slavery in the South, where she died of typhoid fever on a plantation in Mississippi. This is the real-life story on which Toni Morrison based her best-selling novel, Beloved. All right, so here is a website to go along with my presentation. So the name of this resource is called Uncle Tom's Cabin for Children. It's on the Library of Congress website, and we're going to be specifically looking at images 37 through 51, titled Eliza's Escape. So if you click on the resource, it'll take you to the Library of Congress website. And so this version of Uncle Tom's Cabin was made specifically for children because the original version of Uncle Tom's Cabin could be very difficult for some younger readers to understand. And so they made this one. And so page 37 or image 37, if you go to the bottom right here, if you click on it, it'll be Eliza's Escape, and you can scroll through the different pages. So the reason that I think that this resource is valuable for this type of topic is because it would be valuable, in my opinion, for students to be able to read the account of Eliza's escape in the original Uncle Tom's Cabin book and then compare it to the actual account that we just read on thin ice. So there's multiple different reasons why I include this website. So just like I said, it allows students to compare the depiction of Eliza in the story Uncle Tom's Cabin to the real-life Eliza described in the book. Number two, it is fairly short and easy to understand, like I said before. It gives students the opportunity to read Uncle Tom's Cabin in a format easier than reading the original manuscript. And lastly, there are loads of primary and secondary source documents for students to look through and analyze on this website, not just limited to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I'm going to go back to this website. So this is a very, very useful website, especially for social studies teachers. So let's see, there's all kinds of different primary and secondary sources here, and you can download many of them as PDFs. So I'm going to type down like a topic, like let's say World War I or World War II will do. So click on it. Might take a second to load. Scroll. But it has all kinds of sources. So here we go. So right here, there's all kinds of World War II primary source, secondary source documents. So it can be very helpful in the classroom. Lastly, I'm going to go over the standards that align with this read aloud. So the two grades that this would probably be most beneficial is 4th or 8th grade. So it'll be harder for 4th graders probably. You might want to consider excluding some of the things in there possibly, and then just maybe changing some of the words to words that they can better understand. But in 8th grade, I think it would be more appropriate. But it goes along with the 4th grade standard of 4.7, following the War of 1812, Ohio continued to play a key role in national conflicts, including the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad. For the 8th grade, it goes with 8.12. Disputes over the nature of federalism complicated by economic developments in the United States resulted in sectional issues, including slavery, which led to the American Civil War. And lastly, another 8th grade standard, 8.18. Cultural biases, stereotypes, and prejudices had social, political, and economic consequences for minority groups and the population as a whole. So thank you for joining me with this read aloud. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope some of you may consider using it in your future classroom. Thank you.